I am Maya, 32 years old. Last Sunday, during our traditional family cookout, I opened my banking app and saw a negative balance of $85,000. My sister-in-law, Chelsea, simply took a sip of her mimosa and laughed, telling me they needed the money more than I did. My own mother chimed in, calling me selfish for getting upset over a few dollars when my brother was trying to build an empire. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I simply zipped my bag and told them they would not mind what was coming next. 10 seconds later, a massive bang shook the house and the front door flew open. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, stay tuned and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit subscribe to see how I dismantled my family's golden child and his entitled wife in less than 24 hours. The thick, humid air of our Atlanta suburb felt suffocating as I stood on the back patio staring at the glowing red numbers on my phone screen. Negative $85,000. The sounds of classic R&B music playing from the outdoor speakers, and the smell of smoked brisket completely faded into the background. I looked up from my phone and locked eyes with Chelsea. She was lounging on a wicker patio chair, swinging her designer sandals and casually sipping a peach mimosa. "What did you do, Chelsea?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Chelsea rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, please, Maya, do not be so dramatic." She adjusted her expensive sunglasses, which I knew my brother could not actually afford. "You just sit in a dark room typing on a computer all day. What do you even need that much money for anyway? DeAndre needs capital for his new startup. You should consider it your contribution to the family." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. She was completely unbothered. She had just admitted to draining an account with a massive sum of money, and she was treating it like she had borrowed a sweater. DeAndre walked out through the sliding glass doors wearing a custom linen suit that looked ridiculous for a backyard barbecue. He wrapped an arm around Chelsea and flashed his signature charismatic smile. "Come on, little sister," he said smoothly. "I have a massive investment gala coming up this week. I just needed a temporary bridge loan. You know how it is in the business world. When my company takes off, I will buy you a nice little condo." Before I could even respond to the sheer audacity of his words, my mother Yvonne pushed through the screen door carrying a tray of potato salad. She had clearly heard the entire exchange. Instead of dropping the tray in horror at the fact that her daughter-in-law had just committed grand theft, she set it down on the picnic table and gave me a harsh, scolding look. "Maya, stop causing a scene and ruining our Sunday dinner," she snapped, wiping her hands on her apron. "Black families need to build generational wealth together. Your brother is making moves to elevate our family name, and you are crying over some money sitting in a bank account doing nothing. You are being completely selfish." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. Selfish. I repeated the word, tasting the familiar bitterness of her favoritism. "Mom, they stole $85,000 from me." Chelsea literally hacked into my account. Chelsea immediately pressed a hand to her chest, performing the perfect image of a fragile victim. "Yvonne, please tell her to stop yelling at me." Chelsea whimpered, forcing her voice to tremble. "I was just trying to help DeAndre support our family. She is so aggressive for no reason." My mother immediately rushed to Chelsea, putting a protective arm around her white daughter-in-law. "Do not speak to her like that, Maya," my mother demanded, pointing a finger at my face. "Chelsea is family. She is trying to secure your brother's future. You have always been jealous of DeAndre. 10 years ago, I asked you to give up your college savings so your brother could start his first business, and you threw a massive fit back then, too. You always try to hold him back." The memory hit me like a physical blow. 10 years ago, my mother had secretly emptied the college fund I had worked 3 part-time jobs to build. She gave every single penny to DeAndre for a clothing line that went bankrupt in less than 6 months. I had to take out massive student loans and work night shifts just to finish my cybersecurity degree. They never paid me back a single dime. And now history was repeating itself. Only this time, DeAndre and his entitled wife had crossed a line they could not even begin to understand. "You mean the business that failed, Mom?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. the business that left me eating instant noodles for 4 years while DeAndre drove a sports car. My father Jerome stepped out onto the patio holding a pair of grilling tongs. He glared at me with absolute disappointment. "We do not talk about the past in this house," he boomed, his deep voice silencing the music. "Your brother is a visionary. You are just a computer auditor. You need to pull your weight and respect the hierarchy of this family. Now apologize to Chelsea for raising your voice and sit down to eat." They looked at me with smug satisfaction. DeAndre was grinning. Chelsea was hiding a smirk behind her mimosa glass, and my parents stood proudly defending the son who used them and the daughter-in-law who secretly despised them. They all thought I was still the quiet, obedient girl who would swallow her pride to keep the peace. They thought I was just an ordinary corporate worker with a decent savings account. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the cybersecurity firm I audited for. They had no idea that the account Chelsea had just drained was not my personal savings. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at Chelsea, who was taking another arrogant sip of her drink. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly reached down and zipped my leather purse. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Family should elevate each other. Generational wealth is important, so you will not mind what is coming next." Chelsea scoffed, crossing her arms. "What are you going to do, Maya? Call the local police. They will not care about a family dispute." I smiled at her, a cold, terrifying smile that made her falter. "I did not call the local police, Chelsea." Before she could process my words, a deafening bang shook the very foundation of the house. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the living room, followed by the splintering crash of the front door flying entirely off its hinges. Armed federal agents in tactical gear swarmed into the house, their voices booming over the chaos, ordering everyone to freeze. The patio instantly transformed from a lazy Sunday cookout into a chaotic crime scene. At least a dozen agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across their backs poured through the shattered doorway and swarmed the backyard. Their heavy boots trampled right over my mother's prized flower beds, crushing the vibrant hydrangeas she cared about more than she cared about me. "Hands, raise your hands right now," a lead agent shouted, sweeping his gaze across the stunned faces of my family. His hand hovered over his holster, ready for any sudden movements. My brother DeAndre dropped his plate, sending grilled brisket and baked beans tumbling onto the pristine concrete patio. My mother let out a blood-curdling shriek, clutching her chest as if she were the one being attacked by a swarm of intruders. Chelsea stumbled backward, knocking her expensive mimosa glass off the glass table. It shattered against the ground, the sharp sound piercing through the heavy summer air and spraying champagne across her designer sandals. "Maya, what did you do?" My father Jerome bellowed, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and sudden terror. He looked at me as if I were a monster stepping into his home. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there with my hands relaxed by my sides, watching the empire of lies my family had built begin to crumble brick by brick right in front of my eyes. The lead agent stepped forward, holding up a digital tablet displaying an active arrest warrant. "DeAndre Vance and Chelsea Vance," he announced, his voice cutting through my mother's hysterical crying like a knife. "You are both suspects in an ongoing federal cybercrime investigation. Step away from the table and keep your hands where I can see them." For a split second, my brother actually tried to use his fake business mogul charm, thinking he could talk his way out of a federal raid. He smoothed the lapels of his ridiculous linen suit and offered the agent a stiff, heavily practiced smile. "Officer, there must be some kind of massive mistake here," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with forced confidence. "I am a respected entrepreneur in this community. I bring jobs to this city. This is just a minor domestic dispute over a temporary family loan. My little sister Maya over there is just having a misunderstanding about some funds we transferred between accounts. She is overreacting." But Chelsea knew better. The moment the agent reached for his belt, taking out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, her survival instincts kicked in. The arrogant, smirking woman from 5 minutes ago vanished completely. In her place appeared a terrified, fragile victim, desperate to save her own skin. Her eyes welled up with perfectly timed tears, and her breathing became rapid and shallow panting, as if she were being physically threatened. She lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of the nearest federal agent in a desperate plea for sympathy. "Please, you have to listen to me," Chelsea sobbed, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "We did not do anything wrong. It is her." She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at me. "She is a crazy, angry black woman who has always hated me. She is framing us because she is jealous of my husband and our incredible success. She set us up to ruin my life. You have to believe me. I am completely innocent in all of this." I watched her weaponize her tears, hoping her status as a distressed white woman would magically shield her from accountability. My mother, Yvonne, rushed forward, nodding eagerly along with Chelsea's lies. "Yes, officer, my daughter is deeply troubled," Yvonne pleaded, choosing her white daughter-in-law over her own flesh and blood without a second thought. "She has always been jealous of DeAndre. She is making this whole thing up to ruin his startup company. Please do not listen to her." The lead agent gently but firmly detached Chelsea from his arm, stepping back to maintain his perimeter. We traced an unauthorized wire transfer of exactly $85,000 directly to the IP address of this house, originating from a device registered in your specific name. The digital footprint is undeniable. I finally stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. I looked directly into Chelsea's tear-filled eyes and watched the cold panic truly take hold. "You really should have asked what I actually do for a living before you decided to treat my bank account like your personal piggy bank, Chelsea," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and even. "You thought I was just some quiet IT worker doing basic data entry. You thought I was a pathetic pushover who would just swallow the massive financial loss to keep the family peace like I always did in the past." DeAndre glared at me, his charm completely dissolving into panic. "Shut your mouth, Maya," he hissed, taking a step toward me. "You are embarrassing the family in front of the authorities. Fix this right now." I ignored his commands entirely, keeping my eyes locked firmly on my sister-in-law. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Cyber Defense," I explained, watching the color completely drain from Chelsea's face, leaving her looking like a ghost. "We provide encrypted data audits and security architecture for federal agencies. The account you so carelessly hacked into this morning was not my personal savings account. It was a highly monitored corporate escrow account holding cleared funds for a Department of Defense contract." The silence that fell over the backyard was deafening. The only sound was the wind rustling through the oak trees and the heavy, ragged breathing of my brother. "You did not just steal from your little sister, DeAndre?" I continued, turning slowly to look at the golden child who had taken from me my entire life. "You committed federal wire fraud and cyber theft against the United States government, and you were so arrogant that you left a digital trail so wide a first-year intern could have tracked it back to your wife's laptop in under an hour." Chelsea let out a choked, agonizing gasp as the agent grabbed her arms, pulling them roughly behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly, shutting down any further argument. Her fake tears instantly turned into a genuine hysterical panic attack. "DeAndre, you have to do something," she screamed, struggling wildly against the agent's strong grip. "Do not let them take me away. Tell them it was your idea. Tell them you made me do it." DeAndre stood paralyzed, watching his perfect, wealthy life evaporate in front of his eyes. As another agent moved forward to place the handcuffs on his wrists, my father finally snapped out of his frozen shock. His golden boy, the son who was supposed to carry the proud family legacy, was being treated like a common street criminal right on his own patio. Jerome let out a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated fury. He ignored the armed federal agents and charged directly at me, his fists clenched tight, his face twisted in absolute blinding hatred. "You are sending your own brother and your sister-in-law to federal prison," he screamed, spit flying from his lips as he lunged forward. "You vindictive, selfish little rat." He never finished whatever insult he was about to hurl. Before he could take another step toward me, a towering federal agent stepped right into his path, planting a solid, heavy hand against my father's chest and shoving him backward with incredible force. Jerome stumbled wildly, tripping over a fallen patio chair and crashing hard onto the concrete. "Step back right now, sir," the agent commanded, resting his hand firmly on his weapon. "If you take one more step or lay a single finger on a federal contractor, you will be in the holding cell right next to them." The morning sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when my phone began vibrating violently against my nightstand. It was not just one notification, but a continuous buzzing sounding like a swarm of angry hornets. I sat up, pulling the covers aside, and reached for the device. The screen was illuminated with hundreds of missed calls, text messages, and social media alerts. I unlocked the screen and opened the first message from my cousin Marcus. It was just a link with the words, "How could you do this to your own blood?" I clicked the link and was taken to a video that already had over 2 million views. There on my screen was Chelsea. She sat in what looked exactly like her legal office, looking completely disheveled. Her usually perfect blonde hair was tied in a messy knot, and her face was scrubbed free of makeup, leaving her looking exceptionally fragile. Tears were streaming down her face in thick, heavy drops. "Hi, everyone," Chelsea said, her voice trembling for the camera. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this, but I am terrified, and I need the truth out there." Yesterday, the sister of my husband, Maya, orchestrated a terrifying raid on my family. She had me arrested on false federal charges. Chelsea paused, letting out a heartbreaking sob before looking directly into the lens. "Maya has always hated me. She is a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand the fact that her brother married a white woman. She is actively trying to destroy our interracial marriage and ruin the startup company of my husband because she is miserable in her own life. Please share this video and help us fight this terrifying injustice." I stared at the screen, feeling a cold, absolute calm wash over my body. Chelsea was out on bail and had immediately deployed the most dangerous weapon she possessed: white fragility mixed with a massive public platform. She knew exactly what she was doing. By framing my lawful protection of federal funds as the racist vendetta of an angry black woman, she instantly mobilized an army of strangers to her defense. But strangers were not the ones causing my phone to overheat. It was my own extended family. I opened my voicemail and listened to message after message. Aunt Linda called me a disgrace, screaming that I should be ashamed of myself for sending police after the wife of my brother. Uncle David left a rant calling me a traitor, demanding I drop the charges immediately. They ignored the fact that restricted government funds had been stolen. To them, DeAndre was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was the jealous sister trying to tear down his empire. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A normal person would have posted a statement defending their character. A normal person would release bank statements to clear their name and fight back against the mob forming in the comments. But I was not a normal person. I was a cybersecurity auditor who specialized in destroying corporate espionage. I did not waste time arguing with fools on the internet. I dealt strictly in undeniable data. I tossed my phone onto the bed and walked straight into my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of my 3 desktop monitors. I sat down in my leather chair and cracked my knuckles. If Chelsea wanted to play dirty in the court of public opinion, I was going to utterly decimate her in federal court. I logged into the highly secured back-end of Apex Cyber Defense, accessing the deep encrypted server logs for the breached escrow account. The federal agents had frozen the main portal, but as the chief executive officer, I had a backdoor access key to the raw data traffic. I began pulling the digital footprints left behind during the theft. Chelsea was manipulative, but she was definitely not a technical genius. Someone had to have guided her past my initial security protocols. I ran a trace on the network packet requests, isolating the exact minute the money was moved. The logs instantly populated on my left monitor. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing at the glowing text. Chelsea had not acted alone. The security breach did not originate from her personal phone as she claimed to the agents. The server logs showed a dual authentication bypass. Someone had actively fed her the security bypass codes in real time. I ran an internet protocol address trace on the secondary device facilitating the hack. The location pinged directly back to the suburban home of my parents. More importantly, the device identifier matched a custom-built gaming laptop. It was the custom laptop belonging to DeAndre. My brother used the home network of my parents to breach a federal escrow account and then handed the digital keys to his wife so she could execute the transfer. He set her up to pull the trigger while keeping his own hands clean. A heavy knock at my front door shattered the silence of my office. I switched my right monitor to the exterior security cameras. A man in a plain gray suit stood on my porch, holding a thick manila envelope. I walked downstairs and pulled open the heavy wooden door. The man did not smile. "Are you Maya Vance?" he asked. I nodded. "You have been served," he said, shoving the envelope into my hands before turning and walking briskly back to his sedan. I tore open the paper flap and pulled out the legal documents. DeAndre and Chelsea were suing me for defamation and emotional distress. I flipped to the second page and stopped dead. I recognized the law firm representing them. It was the most expensive, ruthless attorney in the state. I checked the bank freeze status on my phone. The bank had a 48-hour processing delay for federal freezes. They hired a lawyer with my stolen money. I drove straight from the sidewalk, where the process server had ambushed me, directly to the glass tower that housed Apex Cyber Defense. The defamation lawsuit sitting on my passenger seat was not a threat. It was an invitation to go to war. Chelsea and DeAndre actually believed they could use my stolen $85,000 to hire a shark defense attorney and paint me as the villain. The preliminary hearing for the civil injunction was scheduled for the very next morning. They wanted a judge to force me to retract my statements to the federal investigators, claiming my cyber theft accusations were destroying their precious startup. I walked into the marble lobby of the courthouse the next day wearing a tailored navy suit. My corporate attorney, Elena, walked beside me carrying a single, slim leather briefcase. Across the aisle, Chelsea was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She wore a modest pastel dress, her hair pulled back to make her look young and innocent. DeAndre sat next to her, looking arrogant in his custom suit, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. My parents, Yvonne and Jerome, were seated right behind them, glaring at me with absolute disgust. My mother actually shook her head and mouthed the word traitor when I made eye contact with her. The lawyer Chelsea hired with my money stood up to address the judge. He was a tall man with an expensive haircut and a voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor," he began, gesturing toward me like I was a stain on the courtroom floor. "This entire case is nothing but a tragic family dispute blown wildly out of proportion by an unstable and deeply jealous sister. Maya Vance is a struggling freelance computer technician who voluntarily transferred $85,000 to her brother to help fund his revolutionary new tech startup. But when she saw his rapid success and his beautiful interracial marriage, her bitter resentment took over. She is now trying to frame my clients with fabricated server logs just to ruin their reputation. We are asking the court to dismiss her claims and grant a permanent injunction against her malicious smear campaign." Chelsea dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, looking at the judge with a trembling lip. My mother nodded vigorously from the gallery, whispering loudly that I had always been a bitter child. The judge turned her stern gaze toward my table, asking if we had a response to these serious allegations. Elena did not even stand up immediately. She calmly opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a single embossed folder. She stood and walked the document directly up to the judge. "Your Honor, my client, Maya Vance, is not a struggling freelancer," Elena said, her voice carrying a cold, lethal authority. "She is the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Cyber Defense, a firm currently valued at over $40 million. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from the face of the defense attorney. DeAndre jerked upright in his chair, his eyes wide with shock. My parents physically recoiled in the gallery as if they had been struck by lightning. Elena continued without missing a beat. The $85,000 in question was not a voluntary family gift. It was a highly restricted escrow fund managed by Apex Cyber Defense for an active Department of Defense contract. We have the federal registration documents, the corporate tax filings, and the sworn affidavits from federal cybercrime agents confirming that the money was illegally wire transferred using unauthorized access codes. My client has no reason to be jealous of a fraudulent startup when she owns a massive corporate empire. The judge reviewed the documents, and her face hardened into a mask of pure fury. She glared down at the defense attorney and asked him if he had independently verified the source of the retainer fee his clients had paid him. The lawyer turned completely pale, realizing he had just accepted stolen federal funds as payment. He began to stammer, grabbing his files and trying to backtrack, but the damage was irreversible. The judge slammed her gavel, dismissing the defamation injunction immediately and warning DeAndre and Chelsea that they were facing severe federal penalties. I did not wait to watch them panic. I walked out of the courtroom, leaving my parents staring after me in absolute stunned silence. They had spent my entire life calling me a failure while treating DeAndre like a king, and in less than 5 minutes, I had shattered their entire illusion. But I knew the federal audit would take time to officially freeze their accounts, and I needed to know exactly what Chelsea was planning to do before the net closed around her. I returned to my office and locked the door to my secure server room. The federal agents had the raw logs, but I had the proprietary tracking software I had designed myself. I needed to follow the exact digital pathway of the stolen money. I cracked my knuckles and began running a deep packet inspection on the transaction routing numbers. Chelsea and DeAndre thought they were clever by using a series of randomized crypto wallets to mask the destination of the wire transfer. I spent 4 hours breaking through their amateur encryption layers. I watched lines of code cascading across my dual monitors as I traced the funds from Atlanta to a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands and then through a digital tumbler designed to wash the money clean. But code never lies, and it never forgets. I isolated the final destination packet and hit the decryption key. The final banking details populated on my screen, and my blood ran ice cold. The money did not go into the corporate holding account for the fake startup company of my brother. It did not go into any account with the name DeAndre Vance attached to it. I leaned closer to the monitor reading the foreign bank registration. The $85,000 had bypassed my brother entirely and landed squarely in an offshore account in Geneva, Switzerland. I pulled up the account holder verification and let out a harsh laugh that echoed in the empty server room. The account was registered exclusively under the maiden name of Chelsea. She was not just stealing from me to fund the lifestyle of her husband. She was hoarding cash in a secret offshore account to completely abandon him when his pathetic Ponzi scheme finally collapsed. I sat back in my leather chair staring at the glowing letters on my monitor. The Swiss bank account registered strictly to the maiden name of Chelsea was the missing piece of the puzzle. This was not just a simple case of my brother stealing from my corporate escrow to fund his extravagant lifestyle. This was a deeply calculated escape plan orchestrated entirely by his own wife. She was setting him up to take the fall for everything while she fled the country with my federal funds. I needed a witness who knew the inner workings of their toxic marriage, someone who could confirm the timeline of her planned escape. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Jenna. Jenna had been the maid of honor at their wedding and the absolute best friend of Chelsea until a spectacular public falling out last month. I sent her a brief message asking to meet, and her reply came instantly, agreeing to a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. I grabbed my car keys and drove through the afternoon traffic, my mind racing with the catastrophic implications of the offshore account. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. I spotted Jenna sitting in a dark corner booth, clutching a paper cup with both hands. She looked incredibly nervous, her eyes darting toward the door as I approached and slid into the booth across from her. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I leaned forward and told her flatly that I knew about the Swiss bank account and the escape plan. Jenna let out a long, shaky breath, and the tension seemed to suddenly leave her shoulders. A bitter, resentful smile crept across her face. She deserves to rot in federal prison, Jenna said, her voice practically vibrating with absolute anger. Chelsea stabbed me in the back last month when she tried to blame me for a missing vendor deposit. But I know everything, Maya. I know the entire empire your brother built is nothing but a house of cards waiting to catch fire. I asked her exactly what she meant by a house of cards. Jenna leaned in closer, looking around the empty cafe to make sure no one was listening to our conversation. DeAndre is completely and utterly broke, Jenna whispered. The tech startup he has been bragging about to your family does not even have a working product or a real engineering team. It is a massive Ponzi scheme. He has been taking huge investments and using the new money to pay off the old investors while skimming millions off the top to pay for the sports cars and the designer clothes and the luxury vacations. A cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach. I asked her who was giving him that kind of money if the company had no real product to sell. Jenna looked down at her coffee cup, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. He is targeting the elderly congregation at the church of your parents, Jenna admitted softly. Your mother and father have been proudly introducing DeAndre to all of their wealthy retired friends at the country club and the church. DeAndre uses his smooth charm to convince these elderly people to hand over their entire life savings and their hard-earned retirement accounts. He promises them massive returns on a revolutionary new application that does not even exist. I sat back against the vinyl booth, feeling physically sick. My own parents were acting as unwitting accomplices, helping my brother drain the life savings of their closest friends. DeAndre was not just an arrogant cybercriminal. He was a ruthless financial predator destroying the lives of innocent senior citizens to fund his massive ego. Chelsea found out the entire scheme was about to collapse. Jenna continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The new investments dried up last month, and the older investors started aggressively demanding their returns. DeAndre was panicking, but Chelsea is completely cold-blooded. She knew the federal raid on your company was the perfect distraction. She hacked your account and routed that $85,000 to her maiden name because it was her final getaway fund. She was planning to board a flight to Europe tomorrow morning, leaving DeAndre behind to take all the blame for the wire fraud and the collapsing Ponzi scheme while she lived like a queen in Switzerland. I absorbed the sheer horrifying scale of the betrayal. Chelsea was willing to let her husband rot in federal prison just to secure her own luxurious escape. And my brother was so blinded by his own arrogance that he had no idea the wife he was fiercely protecting in court was actively packing her bags to abandon him to the wolves. I thanked Jenna for her honesty and walked out of the coffee shop, the afternoon sun feeling strangely cold against my skin. I got back into my car and gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to process the absolute devastation my brother was causing. He was bleeding our own community dry, and my parents were cheering him on from the sidelines the entire time. Just as I started the engine, my cell phone vibrated violently in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen and saw a notification for a long text message from my mother, Yvonne. I unlocked the screen and read the words, my blood turning to pure ice in my veins. The text was not an apology, and it was definitely not a plea for peace. It was a declaration of total family war. If you do not drop these ridiculous jealous charges against your brother and his wife, immediately we are officially disowning you as a daughter, the text read. We know DeAndre is a financial genius, and you are just trying to sabotage him because you will never achieve his incredible level of success. You are a bitter embarrassment to this family. We believe in his vision so much that your father and I just mortgaged our house to give DeAndre $500,000 for his new investment gala this weekend. Do not ever contact us again until you are ready to beg for forgiveness on your knees. I stared at the glowing text message, unable to even blink. My parents had just handed $500,000 of their own hard-earned equity directly into a collapsing criminal Ponzi scheme. They had sacrificed their home, their financial security, and their relationship with their only daughter just to feed the ravenous ego of their golden child, and DeAndre was going to lose every single penny of it before the weekend was over. I sat in my car for a long moment, letting the reality of my mother's text message sink in. $500,000. My parents had literally signed away the roof over their heads to fund a massive delusion. They took out a second mortgage on the home I grew up in just to feed the ravenous ego of a son who was actively stealing from them. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was not another angry message from a delusional relative. It was a direct call from the front desk security of my corporate building. The security guard sounded incredibly tense as he informed me that an older gentleman claiming to be my father was causing a massive scene in the grand marble lobby. The guard said the man was demanding to speak with my manager immediately so he could complain about my behavior. The irony almost made me laugh out loud right there in my car. I told the guard to give him a visitor badge and send him up to the executive suite on the top floor. I drove the short distance back to the Apex Cyber Defense Tower and took my private elevator straight from the underground garage to my office. I wanted to be sitting right at my desk when Jerome Vance finally realized exactly who he was dealing with. My office is a massive corner suite with panoramic views of the city skyline. The inner walls are made of specialized smart glass that I keep frosted for absolute privacy during highly classified federal meetings. I sat behind my solid oak desk, checking my posture and waiting patiently. A few minutes later, the heavy door swung open and my father marched into the room without even bothering to knock. He was wearing his best Sunday suit, the one he specifically saved for church and important business meetings. His face was flushed with a deep, angry red, and he clutched a thick leather folder tightly under his arm. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked around the spacious, luxurious office with a deep scowl. He clearly assumed I had just borrowed a vacant conference room or snuck into the office of my boss just to meet him. "What is this nonsense, Maya?" he barked, slamming the leather folder down onto the polished wood of my desk. "I do not have time to play games with you in whatever empty room you managed to find for your little break. Open that folder right now, and do not say a single word until you finish reading it." I leaned back in my leather chair, keeping my expression completely blank. I reached forward and slowly flipped open the leather cover. Inside was a typed settlement agreement. It was a legally binding document stating that I would immediately drop all criminal and civil charges against DeAndre and Chelsea. It also included a strict gag order demanding I never speak about the escrow funds or the cyber breach ever again to anyone, including federal authorities. My father crossed his arms over his chest, hovering over my desk, just like he used to do when I was a child who misbehaved. "You are going to sign that paper right now," my father demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "Your mother and I are hosting the most important investment gala of your brother's life this weekend. We have invited the entire congregation and every single major investor in the city to celebrate his genius. We will not let your petty, jealous tantrums ruin the reputation of our family or destroy the momentum of his company. You are going to call those federal agents today and tell them you made a massive mistake. You will tell them your little computer accounting error caused all this confusion, and you will clear the name of your brother immediately." I looked at the settlement paper and then looked up at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely invisible. "Dad, do you even know what DeAndre is doing with your money?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and even. "Do you know that his startup company does not actually exist? Your son is running a massive Ponzi scheme. He is stealing the retirement funds of your church friends to pay for his luxury cars and his custom suits. And Chelsea is packing her bags to flee to Europe with the remaining cash as we speak. She used his computer to hack a federal account because she needed a getaway fund, and she is leaving him to take all the blame." Jerome slammed his fist on my desk, making my coffee mug rattle loudly. "Lies," he shouted, his face turning a dark shade of crimson as spit flew from his lips. "Absolute bitter lies. You have always been exactly like this, Maya. Always trying to tear him down because you could never measure up to his greatness. Look at you right now, sitting in some borrowed office pretending to be important while you work some dead-end, low-level computer job. DeAndre is a visionary. He is building an empire from the ground up, He is the legacy of this family, and you are nothing but a miserable disappointment trying to drag him into the mud because you cannot stand to see him shine. Sign the paper, Maya. Sign it right now, or your mother and I will completely disown you. You will have no family left, and we will never speak to you again. I slowly picked up the thick settlement agreement. I did not even bother reading the second page. I ripped the heavy cardstock perfectly in half and let the torn pieces flutter down onto the floor between us. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on the face of my father was something I would remember for the rest of my life. His jaw literally dropped as he stared at the shredded papers on the carpet. I reached under the edge of my oak desk and pressed the small silver button that controlled the smart glass. Instantly, the opaque frost faded away from the interior walls, turning the glass completely transparent. Through the clear walls, my father could suddenly see the massive bustling bullpen of the executive floor. Dozens of employees in sharp business attire were working at high-tech monitoring stations, analyzing global security threats. Directly across from my office, a massive brushed steel logo covered the entire reception wall, reading Apex Cyber Defense. And right on the glass door to the room we were sitting in, elegant silver lettering spelled out the words, Maya Vance, Chief Executive Officer. My father stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes darted from the massive corporate logo to the glass door and finally back to me. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and terrified as the illusion of his golden sun shattered and the reality of my empire finally set in. I stood up from my chair and rested my hands flat on the desk, looking down at him. I am the legacy, Dad. I said, my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. And your son is going to prison. My father could not even speak. He backed slowly out of my glass office, his hands trembling violently as he realized he had just mortgaged his entire life for a criminal. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He stared at the massive steel Apex Cyber Defense logo on the wall and then looked back at me, sitting behind the desk. The absolute horror in his eyes was almost intoxicating. For 27 years, he had treated me like a ghost in my own family, while he worshipped the ground my brother walked on. Now, he was finally seeing the brutal reality. He stumbled backward, bumping into the doorframe, before turning and fleeing down the executive hallway. I watched him stumble toward the elevator, and I felt absolutely nothing for him. He had made his choice years ago, and now he was going to face the catastrophic consequences of his own blind favoritism. But I did not have time to sit and reflect on the shattered ego of my father. The investment gala for the fake tech startup of my brother was only 48 hours away, and I needed to make sure the trap was inescapable. I locked down my office doors and initiated a highly secure encrypted video conference with my chief financial officer and my lead corporate attorney, Elena. I told them I wanted to completely dismantle the financial structure of the holding company DeAndre had created. Elena pulled up the public filings and the hidden debt ledgers we had decrypted earlier that week. DeAndre was incredibly desperate. His Ponzi scheme was bleeding cash faster than he could steal it. To keep the illusion alive and pay for the lavish gala, he had taken out massive high-interest bridge loans from aggressive private equity firms. He owed over $2 million in short-term debt that was secured by the personal assets of my parents and his fake corporate accounts. I instructed Elena to use one of our anonymous offshore shell corporations to buy up every single cent of that toxic debt. The private equity firms were more than happy to offload the high-risk loans for a premium cash buyout. It took less than 6 hours and $5 million of my personal capital to completely acquire the paper. Elena executed the transfers flawlessly, leaving absolutely no digital footprint that could trace back to me or my company. By Friday morning, I was legally the sole owner of the debt for the entire company of my brother. I held the exclusive right to call in the loans and freeze every single asset he had at any moment without warning. I owned his cars, I owned the lease on his fake office, and I owned the very venue where he was hosting his gala. He thought he was the ultimate master manipulator, but he did not realize his own sister held the puppet strings to his entire fake empire. The day of the gala arrived and the city was buzzing with the news of the highly exclusive event. DeAndre had rented out the grand ballroom of the most expensive hotel downtown. He was planning to dazzle the elderly friends of my parents and local angel investors to secure the final millions he needed before his inevitable collapse. I spent the afternoon in a secure briefing room reviewing the final operational details with the Federal Cybercrime Unit. The agents had the Swiss bank account records, the wire fraud evidence, and the complete list of the defrauded senior citizens. The lead federal agent confirmed they would have a tactical team waiting in the service corridors of the hotel ballroom, dressed as catering staff and event security. All they needed was for DeAndre to officially solicit the fraudulent investments on stage in front of the crowd to trigger the final wire fraud trap. Once he asked for the money on a microphone, the federal net would snap shut. I went home to prepare for the evening and stood in front of my full-length mirror. For years, my mother had always demanded I wear modest, sensible clothes to family events, so I would not upstage Chelsea or draw attention away from my brother. I walked right past those boring gray dresses and opened the locked cedar closet where I kept my executive wardrobe. I chose a stunning tailored emerald green silk suit that screamed absolute power and authority. The sharp lines of the jacket and the flawless cut of the trousers made me look like royalty. I paired it with custom Italian heels that echoed loudly on the hardwood floor and a vintage diamond necklace I had bought to celebrate my first $10 million federal defense contract. I looked like the chief executive of a massive corporate empire because that is exactly what I was. I was not the invisible little sister hiding in the shadows anymore. I was the apex predator stepping out into the light. As I was finishing my dark, dramatic makeup, my cell phone vibrated violently on the vanity. I unlocked the screen and saw a picture message from DeAndre. It was a selfie of him and Chelsea standing in the empty grand ballroom, surrounded by lavish floral arrangements and towering crystal chandeliers. They were holding up crystal flutes and popping a massive bottle of expensive vintage champagne. Their faces were twisted into arrogant, triumphant smiles. Chelsea looked especially smug wearing a designer gown paid for with the money she had stolen from my federal escrow account. But looking closely at her eyes, I could see the cold calculation hiding behind the fake smile. She was probably mentally counting down the exact hours until she could transfer the new investor funds to her secret Swiss account and catch her private flight to Geneva, leaving my brother to rot. Beneath the photo was a block of text dripping with sheer delusion. "You lost, little girl," the text read. "Tonight, we secure $2 million from the biggest investors in the city. Mom and Dad are our guests of honor, and everyone knows you are just a jealous failure. Your pathetic lies did not work, and my company is going to change the world. Do not even bother showing up tonight, because security has your photo and strict orders to throw you out on the street where you belong." I read the arrogant message twice, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. He was so blinded by his own vanity that he could not see the massive federal net closing around his throat. He actually believed he had won. He believed he had outsmarted the sister he had mocked his entire life. They thought they were the absolute royalty of the city, playing a brilliant game of chess against a helpless victim. They did not even realize the game was already over and the board was completely mine. I picked up my phone and typed my response, my thumbs flying across the smooth glass screen. I did not type an angry paragraph or a bitter threat or a warning. I simply typed, "I would not miss it for the world." I hit send and slipped the phone into my designer evening clutch. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, ready to burn his imaginary kingdom to the absolute ground. The drive to the luxury hotel in Buckhead was a blur of neon lights and cold anticipation. I pulled my car up to the valet stand and stepped out into the humid evening air. The emerald green silk of my suit caught the light of the flashbulbs near the entrance. DeAndre had actually hired fake paparazzi to stand behind velvet ropes, taking pictures of his guests to make his fake tech startup seem like a massive Silicon Valley success. It was a pathetic display of vanity, but it was exactly what I expected from a man who built his entire life on illusions. I walked through the heavy glass doors and into the grand lobby. The opulent crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the marble floors. Elena was already waiting for me near the cloakroom. She was flanked by two senior partners from our corporate law firm, both wearing sharp, dark suits and carrying identical leather briefcases. They looked like a firing squad ready to execute a corporate takeover. Elena gave me a single sharp nod, and we walked together toward the grand ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom were wide open, and the sound of a live jazz quartet drifted out into the hallway. I paused just outside the entrance, watching the spectacle unfold. The room was packed with hundreds of people. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. The entire space was decorated in silver and ice blue, the fake corporate colors of the imaginary company of my brother. In the center of the room, DeAndre was holding court. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, looking every bit the successful young mogul he desperately wanted to be. He was laughing loudly, holding a glass of champagne in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other. Chelsea stood perfectly positioned at his side, playing the role of the supportive, elegant wife. She wore a glittering silver gown that hugged her figure, her hair styled in soft, immaculate waves. She gazed up at DeAndre with absolute adoration, but I knew she was just counting the seconds until she could board her flight to Switzerland. Not far from them, my parents were parading around the room like absolute royalty. My mother Yvonne wore a heavy sequined dress and a massive diamond necklace that was undoubtedly purchased with the stolen money. My father Jerome stood beside her, beaming with pure arrogance. They had cornered a group of elderly members from their church congregation. I recognized Pastor Thomas and several of the older widows who had known me since I was a child. My father was speaking loudly, making sure everyone around them could hear his boasting. "Look at what my boy has built," Jerome said, sweeping his arm across the lavish ballroom. "We always knew DeAndre was destined for greatness. He is a true financial visionary. This company is going to change the world, and we are so blessed to be able to share this incredible ground floor opportunity with our beloved church family." My mother nodded vigorously, placing her hand on the arm of an elderly woman who looked entirely out of place in the lavish setting. "We just want to see all of you prosper," Yvonne added, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "DeAndre is offering guaranteed returns because he cares about his community. Your retirement funds could not possibly be in safer hands." I felt a wave of pure nausea wash over me. My parents were actively manipulating their own friends, serving them up on a silver platter for my brother to devour. They were using decades of trust and religious faith to convince innocent retired people to hand over their life savings to a criminal. They had mortgaged their own home to fund this party, and now they were dragging their entire community down into the abyss with them. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, clinical anger freeze out the last remaining shreds of sorrow. I gave Elena a look and stepped through the mahogany doors. My Italian heels clicked sharply against the marble floor of the entryway before sinking into the plush carpet of the ballroom. Elena and the two senior partners flanked me, their presence radiating a heavy, lethal authority. It did not take long for the crowd to notice us. The vibrant emerald green of my suit cut through the sea of dull black tuxedos and silver dresses like a blade. People began to part ways, whispering to one another as we walked straight down the center of the room. The jazz quartet seemed to falter for a moment as the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly shifted from celebratory to tense. DeAndre was mid-laugh when he finally saw me. The arrogant sound died in his throat and his smile vanished instantly. His eyes widened in genuine shock as he stared at the sister he had explicitly banned from his little kingdom. Chelsea noticed his sudden silence and followed his gaze, her fake smile melting into a mask of pure panic. She gripped the arm of my brother so tightly her knuckles turned white. My parents spotted me a second later. My mother actually dropped her champagne flute, letting it shatter against the floor. My father took a step forward, his face twisting into a furious scowl. He abandoned the church elders and marched aggressively toward the center of the room, positioning himself like a shield in front of DeAndre. "What is the meaning of this?" my father demanded, his voice booming over the quiet whispers of the crowd. "You are told you are not welcome here, Maya. This is a private event for serious investors and family members who actually support each other. You are trespassing." DeAndre recovered from his initial shock and puffed out his chest, trying to regain control of his audience. He snapped his fingers, gesturing wildly toward the edge of the room. "Security!" he yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "I want this woman removed from the premises immediately. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to cause a scene. Get her out of my building right now." 4 large security guards in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the walls and moved quickly toward me. The crowd gasped and stepped back, giving them a wide berth. The church elders looked completely bewildered, watching the golden boy of the family order his own sister to be dragged out by force. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, staring directly into the terrified eyes of my brother. The head of security, a massive man with a stern face, approached me and reached out his hand to grab my arm. "Mom, you need to leave the property right now," he said, his voice gruff and commanding. Elena stepped smoothly in front of me, intercepting the guard before he could touch me. She did not raise her voice, and she did not look intimidated. She calmly reached into her slim leather briefcase and pulled out a single thick piece of paper, bearing a heavy embossed seal. She held the document up, placing it directly in front of the face of the head security guard. "You might want to read this very carefully before you touch the owner of this building," Elena said, her voice carrying a cold, lethal authority. The head of security stopped dead in his tracks. He squinted at the document, his eyes scanning the legal text and the official signatures. I watched as the color slowly drained from his face. He looked from the paper to Elena and then finally to me. He swallowed hard, visibly terrified by what he had just read. Without saying a single word, the massive security guard took a slow, deliberate step backward. He lowered his hands and turned to the other 3 guards, giving them a sharp nod. To the absolute shock of my brother, my parents, and the entire crowded ballroom, the 4 security guards stepped back and silently parted the way for me. I walked straight through the gap the security guards had made for me, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps as I approached the center of the ballroom. DeAndre stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open as he watched his own hired muscle step aside to let me pass. My father lowered his arm, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. The entire ballroom had gone deathly quiet, the jazz quartet having completely stopped playing. The only sound was the clicking of my heels as I bypassed my stunned parents and walked directly toward the stage. DeAndre realized what was happening, and desperation finally shattered his arrogant facade. He scrambled up the short steps to the stage, his hands shaking as he grabbed the microphone from the polished stand. He looked out at the sea of confused faces, specifically targeting the front row where Pastor Thomas and the church elders were seated. He was sweating profusely through his custom velvet suit, his eyes wide and frantic. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse the brief interruption," he stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly. "We are going to move right along to the most important part of the evening. The investment window for Gala Tech is closing in exactly 10 minutes. I need everyone who brought their pension checks and retirement transfers to bring them to the stage right now. This is your last chance to secure generational wealth for your families before the federal regulators close the funding round." He was literally begging them to hand over their life savings to plug the massive hole in his sinking ship. Pastor Thomas looked confused, but he dutifully reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Several other elderly members of the congregation began rummaging through their purses and jackets, pulling out the checks that represented decades of their hard work and sacrifice. My mother stood in the front row, clapping her hands together and urging them forward, completely blind to the reality of what was happening right in front of her face. I did not stop walking. I reached the edge of the stage and climbed the 3 carpeted steps, my emerald green suit catching the harsh glare of the stage lights. DeAndre saw me coming and tried to turn his back, shielding the microphone with his body, but he was shaking too hard. I walked right up to him and gripped the cold metal of the microphone. He tried to pull it away, but I stared directly into his panicked eyes and yanked it violently out of his trembling hand. The sudden screech of audio feedback echoed through the grand ballroom, making several people cover their ears. DeAndre stumbled backward, looking around for his security team, but the guards remained firmly planted against the walls, following the orders of the actual owner of the building. I turned my back on my brother and looked out over the sea of faces. I saw my parents staring up at me in absolute horror. I saw Chelsea inching her way toward the side exit, her silver gown catching the light as she desperately tried to escape the room before the truth came out. "My brother talks a lot about generational wealth," I announced to the completely silent room, my voice ringing out clear and steady through the massive speakers. "He talks about revolutionizing technology and building an empire for this community. So let's look at his." I pulled my secure encrypted tablet from my clutch. I tapped the screen and engaged the wireless override protocol I had specifically designed for this hotel network. The massive digital projector screen hanging behind the stage flickered and went black for a split second. DeAndre let out a strangled gasp and tried to lunge for the podium to unplug the system, but Elena and my corporate legal team stepped up to the edge of the stage, blocking his path with their cold, intimidating presence. The projector screen flared back to life, illuminating the entire ballroom with bright, glaring light. Instead of the slick marketing presentation DeAndre had prepared, the screen now displayed a massive, complex financial flowchart. At the top of the chart was the logo for his fake tech startup. Beneath it were dozens of red arrows pointing downward, tracing the exact path of the investment funds. I tapped my tablet again, and the screen zoomed in on the banking ledgers. "These are the corporate accounts for Galatech," I said into the microphone, pointing at the screen. "As you can see, there is no engineering team. There is no software development. There is absolutely no product. Every single dollar that was invested into this company over the past 6 months was immediately diverted." The crowd gasped as the screen shifted again, showing the destination of the funds. The screen displayed high-resolution copies of wire transfers and bank statements. The money was flowing directly into personal accounts, paying for luxury car leases, expensive vacations, and thousands of dollars in high-end retail purchases. But the most damning piece of evidence was yet to come. I tapped the screen one final time, and the massive display filled with the offshore banking records I had decrypted earlier that week. "And this," I continued, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd, "is where the rest of your money went." 2 days ago, the final remaining balance of the Galatech corporate account was illegally wired to a private Swiss bank account, registered exclusively under the maiden name of Chelsea Vance. She is scheduled to fly out of the country tomorrow morning, leaving all of you with nothing. The silence in the room shattered like brittle glass. Absolute chaos erupted across the grand ballroom. Pastor Thomas dropped the envelope containing his pension check, his face twisting in horror as he stared at the empty zero balance displayed next to his investment account on the screen. Elderly men and women began shouting out in panic, realizing that their entire life savings had been vaporized to fund a criminal lifestyle. My mother, Yvonne, let out a piercing wail and physically collapsed into the arms of my father, who looked like he was going to be violently ill. The people they had recruited, the friends they had convinced to invest, were now turning on them, screaming and demanding their money back. DeAndre was completely losing his mind. He spun around and saw the undeniable proof of his crimes projected in 20-foot letters for the entire city to see. The illusion was dead. His empire was dust. He turned toward me, his face contorted into a mask of pure feral rage. He lunged forward, screaming at the top of his lungs, calling me every vile name he could think of, his hands reaching out to grab me. He blamed me for destroying his life. He blamed me for the missing money. And he screamed that I was a jealous monster who ruined his legacy. I just stood there, calmly holding the microphone and watching him unravel, knowing the federal agents were already moving in from the shadows. While my brother continued to scream and thrash against the invisible walls of his collapsing reality on the stage, my eyes caught a sudden frantic movement near the far edge of the ballroom. The crowd was still surging and shouting, but through the absolute chaos, I locked onto a flash of silver silk. It was Chelsea. While her husband was having a complete mental breakdown in front of the entire city, she was using the massive distraction to quietly slip away. She had abandoned her elegant, supportive wife routine entirely. Her face was pale and slick with panicked sweat, and she was moving with the desperate, hurried steps of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. Slung over her delicate shoulder was a massive designer duffel bag that looked incredibly heavy. She was keeping her head down, using the panicked church elders as a physical shield to obscure her path toward the heavy mahogany side doors that led to the service elevators and eventually the parking garage. I did not even bother responding to the pathetic insults being hurled at me by my brother. I simply dropped the microphone onto the wooden stage floor, where it landed with a loud, dull thud that echoed over the massive speaker system. I stepped down from the platform and walked purposefully through the surging crowd. Elena and my legal team moved in perfect synchronization with me, parting the sea of hysterical investors with their imposing presence. Elderly men and women were crying and demanding their money back, but my focus was completely dialed in on the silver dress retreating into the shadows. Chelsea was only 3 steps away from the heavy brass handle of the exit door when I stepped directly into her path, blocking her escape route entirely. She collided heavily with me and stumbled backward, letting out a sharp gasp of pure surprise. She looked up and saw me standing there in my emerald green suit, and the sheer terror in her wide eyes was absolutely intoxicating. She immediately tried to adjust her features, forcing a trembling, pathetic smile onto her face. She tried to play the role of the innocent, frightened victim caught in the middle of a massive corporate misunderstanding. "Maya, please, you have to let me pass," she whispered, her voice shaking violently over the roar of the crowd. "I am just so scared and overwhelmed by all these angry people. I need to get to safety before someone gets hurt. DeAndre has completely lost his mind and I cannot be here when the police arrive. You have to understand I had nothing to do with this." I looked down at the massive designer duffel bag clutched tightly in her perfectly manicured hands. It was bulging at the seams, completely ruining the elegant silhouette of her expensive silver gown. I did not say a single word to her. I just stared at the heavy bag, and then back up at her terrified face. She tried to step around me, clutching the luggage closer to her chest, but Elena moved smoothly to block her right side, while one of my senior partners blocked her left. The sheer panic in the eyes of my sister-in-law morphed into vicious cornered desperation. "You have no right to hold me here," she hissed, dropping the innocent act completely. "Get out of my way right now or I will scream for security." I shifted my weight and drove the pointed toe of my custom Italian heel directly into the center of the heavy duffel bag. The sudden force of the kick knocked the bag out of her hands entirely. It hit the solid marble floor with a heavy thud, and the expensive zipper violently burst open under the massive pressure. The contents of the bag spilled out across the polished floor for everyone to see. Perfectly wrapped stacks of $100 bills tumbled over the marble, mingling with heavy velvet jewelry boxes and diamond necklaces she had hurriedly stripped from her own vanity. But the most damning piece of evidence fluttered out and landed face up right at the feet of my legal team. It was a printed itinerary and a one-way first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland, departing in less than 3 hours. I looked at the ticket and then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. "Going somewhere without your husband, Chelsea?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly over the localized chaos of the crowd around us. The people nearby had stopped shouting and were now staring down at the scattered fortune on the floor. The church elders, who had just realized they lost their entire life savings, were looking at the stacks of stolen cash and the first-class plane ticket. The murmurs of confusion quickly turned into a low, dangerous rumble of pure anger. They realized they were looking at the exact woman who was trying to smuggle their retirement funds out of the country while they wept in the center of the room. Chelsea looked around at the furious faces closing in on her. She was completely trapped. The side exit was blocked by my legal team, and the ballroom was filled with hundreds of people she had actively helped defraud. Her luxurious silver dress suddenly looked like a prison uniform. She realized that her charm and her money and her fake innocence could not save her anymore. So she resorted to the absolute lowest, most pathetic defense mechanism she had left in her arsenal. She activated the white tears. Her face crumpled, and she let out a loud, theatrical sob, dropping to her knees amid the scattered cash. She covered her face with her hands and began to wail hysterically, ensuring that every single person in the room, including the approaching federal agents, could hear her performance. She looked up at the crowd, tears streaming through her expensive makeup, and pointed a shaking finger directly toward the stage where DeAndre was currently being subdued by two undercover federal agents. "He forced me," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing through the sudden quiet of the massive ballroom. "I did not want to do any of this, but he forced me to pack this bag. You know how these black men are. He threatened me. He told me he would hurt me if I did not help him hide the money. I am just a victim. I was terrified for my life. Please, you have to believe me, he is a violent monster, and I was just trying to escape his abuse." The entire ballroom went dead silent at the sheer toxic racism of her words. The church elders who had known DeAndre since he was a little boy stared at the weeping woman on the floor with absolute disgust. The ugly truth of how she really viewed the community she had been robbing was finally exposed. But the most satisfying reaction came from the stage. DeAndre had stopped fighting the federal agents. He was standing perfectly still, staring across the huge room at the woman he had worshipped and showered with stolen millions. His jaw slackened, and the last remaining fragments of his massive ego crumbled into absolute dust. He was staring at his beautiful, elegant wife and finally seeing the venomous, racist snake hiding beneath the silver dress. She had not only planned to abandon him to take the fall for her crimes, but when cornered, she had weaponized his race against him, relying on the ugliest stereotypes imaginable just to save her own skin. He stared at her in absolute horror, the brutal reality of her racism and her betrayal laying his entire fraudulent life completely bare. The federal agents did not hesitate for a single second. They moved in with brutal efficiency, pulling the arms of my brother behind his back and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the microphone that was still lying on the floor, amplifying the sound of his absolute defeat. DeAndre did not even fight them. He was completely broken, staring blankly at Chelsea, who was now being detained by two other agents while she continued to weep her fake tears. The church elders were shouting, demanding their checks back, and the entire ballroom was a swirling vortex of panic and betrayal. But the true climax of the evening had not even happened yet. Through the sea of angry investors, I saw a flash of heavy sequins. My mother Yvonne pushed her way through the chaotic crowd, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive diamond necklace hung crookedly against her collarbone. She was sobbing hysterically, tears of fury and terror streaming down her cheeks. She lunged directly at me, her hands raised as if she wanted to physically tear me apart, right there in the middle of the ballroom. Elena and my legal team immediately moved to intercept her, stepping firmly in front of me to block the attack, but I held up my hand, signaling them to stand down. I wanted to face my mother directly. I wanted to look her in the eyes when her entire world finally collapsed. Yvonne stopped just inches away from me, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. "You ruined us!" she screamed, her voice shrill and raw, echoing off the marble pillars. "You malicious, vindictive little girl, you have destroyed your own family. DeAndre was going to make us rich, and you just had to ruin it because you have always been jealous of him. We mortgaged our house for this event. We gave him every last cent we had to rent this ballroom and hire the staff. We are going to be homeless because of you." My father Jerome appeared behind her looking pale and terrified. He was no longer the arrogant, boasting patriarch who had paraded around the church elders just an hour ago. He looked small and pathetic standing in the shadow of his hysterical wife. They both looked at me, expecting me to apologize, expecting me to shrink away from their anger, just like I had done my entire childhood when they blamed me for the failures of my brother. But I did not flinch. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or sorrow for the people who had gladly funded a criminal empire while treating their own daughter like a worthless ghost. I looked at my mother and let a cold, slow smile spread across my face. I reached out to Elena, who silently handed me a thick, heavy legal envelope. It was sealed with crisp red wax and carried the embossed corporate logo of my firm. I held it out toward my mother. She stared at it, her hands shaking violently, refusing to take it. "Take it!" I commanded, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that cut right through her hysterical sobbing. She slowly reached out and took the heavy envelope, her eyes darting between my face and the thick paper. "Open it and read the name of the lender, Mom," I said, watching her face closely. "Read the name of the private equity firm that bought the toxic debt on your family home." Yvonne ripped the envelope open with shaking fingers, pulling out the thick stack of legal documents. The top page was a deed of trust and a formal notice of default. Her eyes scanned the heavy black text, reading the names of the holding companies and the signatures on the bottom line. Jerome leaned over her shoulder, his eyes widening in pure horror as he processed the legal jargon. They had been so desperate to fund the imaginary empire of their golden child that they had signed away the deed to their home to an anonymous offshore shell corporation without reading the fine print. They thought they were dealing with a faceless private equity firm that would give them an extension when the money ran out. They never bothered to research the actual owner of the massive holding company that approved their reckless loan. The color drained entirely from the face of my mother. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the legal papers slipped from her grasp and scattered across the plush carpet, mingling with the stolen cash that Chelsea had dropped earlier. Her knees literally buckled beneath her. She let out a hollow, devastated gasp and collapsed onto the floor, sitting in the middle of her own financial ruin. My father stumbled backward, clutching his chest, as if he had just been physically struck, staring at me like I was a ghost. "It is my corporation, Mom," I said, looking down at her crumpled form. "The shell company that bought your bridge loans and the mortgage on your house is a subsidiary of my cyber defense firm. I own your debt. I own the lease on this fake ballroom. I own the cars you drove here tonight. And as of 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, when the bank opens, I legally own the house you have lived in for 30 years. You gave everything you had to a liar, and you did not even realize you were handing the keys to your entire life directly to the daughter you spent decades treating like garbage." The church elders watched the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. Pastor Thomas shook his head in absolute disgust, turning his back on my parents. They had tried to sell out their own congregation to fund their greed, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. DeAndre was watching from the stage, tears finally spilling down his cheeks as the federal agents hauled him toward the service elevator. He was watching his mother weeping on the floor, knowing that his lies had finally cost them everything they held dear. Yvonne sat on the floor, sobbing into her hands, completely broken and humiliated in front of the entire high society crowd she had tried so hard to impress. She had mortgaged her soul to protect the vanity of her son, and now she was paying the absolute maximum price. I looked at my parents kneeling in the ruins of their own making, and I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck since childhood were finally shattered. I turned my back on them, adjusting the lapels of my emerald silk suit, and walked toward the grand exit with Elena at my side, leaving them to face the federal agents and the fury of the people they had helped destroy. DeAndre watched his elegant wife weeping on the marble floor, and the sheer magnitude of his absolute failure finally snapped him out of his paralyzed trance. The undercover federal agents had momentarily loosened their grip on his arms when Chelsea began her hysterical racist performance. but now they were recovering from the shock and moving back in. DeAndre looked at the agents and then looked at the furious faces of the investors closing in around the stage. His survival instinct finally kicked in. With a sudden violent jerk, he ripped his arm away from the nearest agent. The custom velvet of his expensive tuxedo jacket tore loudly at the shoulder, but he did not care. He shoved past the podium and leaped off the side of the stage, hitting the floor in a desperate sprint toward the main mahogany doors. He actually thought he could just run away like he always did. He thought he could leave my parents to face the absolute ruin he had created and vanish into the humid Atlanta night, leaving his mess behind for someone else to clean up. But he completely miscalculated the sheer rage of the people he had betrayed. Pastor Thomas had been standing near the center aisle clutching the empty envelope that was supposed to hold his retirement future. When he saw DeAndre making a break for the exit, the elderly pastor did not shrink back or step out of the way. He stepped directly into the center of the aisle, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. Sister Miller, the sweet, elderly woman who used to bake peach cobblers for DeAndre every single summer, immediately stepped up right beside the pastor. Within seconds, a solid human wall of furious church elders formed across the main exit, blocking the heavy wooden doors completely. DeAndre skidded to a halt, his leather dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble. He looked at the wall of people who had practically raised him. These were the people who had celebrated his high school graduation, who had prayed for him when he went off to college, and who had blindly trusted him with the money they needed to survive their final years. Now they were staring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Move out of my way!" DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You do not understand what is happening here. My sister set me up. This is all a massive misunderstanding, and I can get the money back. I just need to get to my car." Nobody moved a single inch. Deacon Hayes, a retired mechanic with broad, heavy shoulders, crossed his arms over his chest, forming an impenetrable physical barrier. "You are not going anywhere, son," Deacon Hayes said, his voice rumbling with a quiet, dangerous anger. "You sat in my living room, drank my sweet tea, and promised me my pension would double. You looked my wife in the eye and swore on the Holy Bible that our money was safe. You are going to stand right here and tell us exactly where our life savings went." DeAndre was hyperventilating now. Thick drops of sweat were pouring down his face, ruining his perfect grooming and soaking into his torn velvet collar. He looked back over his shoulder. The federal agents were advancing steadily through the crowd, closing the net. He looked at the side doors, but my corporate legal team was still blocking that exit, and Chelsea was currently crying hysterically on the floor, surrounded by her own spilled cash and her ruined escape plan. He was completely and utterly trapped. "Please," DeAndre begged, turning back to Pastor Thomas, his arrogance completely stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified little boy. "Please, Pastor, you have known me my whole life. You know my heart. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Maya did this to me. She froze my accounts. Just let me out of this room and I promise I will make everyone whole again. I swear I will fix this." Pastor Thomas looked at the ruined velvet suit and the desperate lying eyes of my brother. The elderly man slowly shook his head, his expression filled with a profound sorrow that was far worse than any anger. "You used the Lord to rob the poor, DeAndre," the pastor said, his voice carrying a heavy, mournful weight. "There is no fixing what you have done to this community. Your heart is completely corrupted by greed, and tonight you are going to reap exactly what you have sown." DeAndre let out a frustrated scream and actually tried to physically push his way through the line of elderly parishioners. He shoved Sister Miller hard enough to make her stumble backward, but Deacon Hayes immediately grabbed him by the collar of his torn tuxedo jacket and shoved him forcefully back into the center of the room. The crowd surged forward, pressing in on him from all sides, shouting and demanding their money. The golden boy of the family was now standing in the middle of a furious mob, trembling and sweating with absolutely nowhere left to run. I watched the entire pathetic scene unfold from my vantage point near the cloakroom, Elena standing silently by my side. For 27 years, I had watched my parents shield him from every single consequence. I had watched them blame me for his mistakes and mortgage their own future just to maintain his fragile ego. Now there was no one left to protect him. My mother was still sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, clutching the foreclosure notice to her chest, entirely lost in her own financial destruction. My father was staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the reality of his ruin. They could not save him this time. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted. The heavy, humid air seemed to crackle with a new, intense energy. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows along the far wall of the ballroom overlooked the busy downtown street. Through the sheer silk curtains, brilliant flashes of red and blue light began to violently pulse against the glass. The rhythmic strobing colors painted the silver and ice blue decorations of the fake gala with harsh, terrifying neon tones. A second later, the deafening wail of multiple sirens pierced through the heavy glass windows, echoing loudly over the shouts of the angry investors. The sound was overwhelming, a mechanical scream that signaled the absolute end of the illusion. The main mahogany doors burst open behind the wall of church elders. The elderly parishioners quickly parted, stepping aside as a fully armed tactical team of federal agents flooded into the grand ballroom. They were wearing heavy, dark vests, with FBI printed in bold yellow letters across the back. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, marched directly down the center aisle toward the stage, his gold badge held high in the air. "DeAndre Stevens!" The lead agent shouted, his voice cutting through the remaining noise in the room. "We have federal warrants for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and operating an illegal Ponzi scheme. You are going to put your hands on your head and drop to your knees right now." DeAndre looked at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the opulent crystal chandeliers. He looked at the federal agents surrounding him with steel handcuffs ready. The last shred of defiance vanished from his eyes. He slowly raised his trembling hands and dropped to his knees on the plush carpet, surrendering to the devastating reality that his fake kingdom had finally fallen. The harsh fluorescent lights of the downtown federal field office were a brutal, agonizing contrast to the warm crystal chandeliers of the ballroom we had just left. The air in the building was cold and sterile, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. I stood silently in the dark observation room, my arms crossed over my emerald green suit, watching through the heavy two-way glass. On the other side of the mirror, Chelsea was sitting at a bolted-down stainless steel table in interrogation room B. She had been stripped of her designer jewelry and was wrapped in a cheap, scratchy gray blanket, shivering as she clutched a small paper cup of water. She was currently delivering a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Sitting across from her were two seasoned FBI agents, but Chelsea was playing them exactly like she had played the church elders. She wept softly, letting her tears perfectly streak her ruined makeup. She painted a picture of absolute terror and victimhood. She told the agents that DeAndre was a controlling, abusive monster who kept her isolated from her friends and family. She claimed she had no idea what his business actually did, and that she only signed the banking documents because he screamed at her and threatened her if she asked any questions. She leaned heavily into her delicate, innocent routine, portraying herself as a naive woman who had been hopelessly manipulated by a smooth-talking, aggressive black man. She was actively weaponizing every ugly societal stereotype she could reach, trying to throw her husband completely under the bus to secure her own immunity. I watched her bat her tear-soaked eyelashes and swear to the agents that she was packing that massive duffel bag of cash only because DeAndre ordered her to do it. The lead agent, a tall, sharp-eyed woman named Rollins, stepped out of the interrogation room and joined me in the dark observation space. She let out a heavy, exhausted sigh and rubbed her temples. "Your sister-in-law is sticking to the battered wife defense," Rollins murmured, looking through the glass. "She is claiming full ignorance. She says she is willing to testify against your brother in exchange for a plea deal and witness protection." I did not flinch. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a small black encrypted flash drive. I held it out to Agent Rollins. "My sister-in-law is a phenomenal actress." I said, my voice low and steady, but her digital footprint tells a completely different story. "I suggest you read what is on this drive before you offer her any kind of deal." Rollins took the drive and plugged it into the secure terminal on the desk. I had already bypassed the military-grade encryption on Chelsea's offshore accounts earlier that week, but what I found in her private communications was far worse than simple wire fraud. The screen illuminated with hundreds of pages of decrypted chat logs from a highly secure anonymous messaging app. Rollins began to read the transcripts, and her eyes widened in absolute shock. The logs were conversations between Chelsea and a team of freelance offshore hackers, as well as an illegal wealth manager based in Geneva. The messages proved undeniably that Chelsea was not some terrified, ignorant victim. She was the actual mastermind behind the entire operation. She was the one who originally suggested using my parents and the church congregation as easy, gullible marks. She had written explicit instructions on how to leverage DeAndre's arrogant golden boy status to blind his family to the truth. Worse yet, the logs revealed that she was the one who had orchestrated the attempted hack on my corporate accounts. She had paid the mercenaries to breach my servers, hoping to frame me for the missing Galatech funds. There were dozens of messages where she brutally mocked DeAndre, calling him a pathetic, easily manipulated narcissist who was too busy staring at himself in the mirror to realize his wife was draining his company dry. She had laid out her entire escape plan in pristine detail, explaining exactly how she would leave him to face the FBI alone while she vanished into the Swiss Alps with millions. Agent Rollins printed the thick stack of chat logs and marched right back into the interrogation room. Chelsea looked up with wide, hopeful eyes, clearly expecting to be told she was free to go home. Instead, Rollins slammed the massive stack of transcripts down onto the metal table with a deafening crack. Rollins did not yell. She just calmly began reading Chelsea's own vicious, racist, and calculating words back to her out loud. The fragile victim routine vanished in the blink of an eye. Chelsea's face hardened into a pale, rigid mask of pure venomous rage. The tears stopped instantly. Her jaw locked and she glared at the two-way mirror as if she knew I was standing on the other side watching her ultimate destruction. She immediately demanded a lawyer and refused to speak another syllable, but the permanent damage was already done. The next morning, the reality of her situation came crashing down inside the federal courthouse. The sterile courtroom was packed with reporters and furious investors. Chelsea stood before the federal judge wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit, her wrists and ankles bound by heavy metal chains. Her expensive silver gown was gone, and her natural hair hung limp and unstyled around her face. The federal prosecutor presented the flight itinerary to Geneva, the hidden Swiss bank accounts, and the massive duffel bag of stolen cash we had intercepted at the gala. The judge looked at Chelsea with absolute disgust. He struck his heavy wooden gavel and immediately denied her bail, labeling her an extreme and imminent flight risk. Chelsea actually shrieked and fought against the marshals as they dragged her out of the courtroom, her dignified facade entirely replaced by feral, panicked screeching. Meanwhile, down in the cold concrete holding cells beneath the courthouse, DeAndre was experiencing a completely different kind of hell. He sat shivering on a hard metal bench, his custom velvet suit hopelessly wrinkled and stained with the sweat of his own panic. Earlier that morning, the federal agents had showed him the printed chat logs to secure his full cooperation. He sat there for hours staring at the highlighted text, reading the brutal words of his beautiful, elegant wife, mocking his intelligence, and outlining exactly how she planned to destroy his life. She had written that he was too stupid to notice the missing money. She had written that his parents had made him so arrogant and entitled that he never actually checked the ledgers. The crushing, suffocating weight of reality finally settled over his shoulders, breaking him in half. He realized that Chelsea had never loved him. She had targeted him specifically because he was so incredibly easy to manipulate. His parents, Yvonne and Jerome, had spent his entire life shielding him from consequences, inflating his ego, and convincing him he was a flawless genius who deserved the world on a silver platter. They had never forced him to work for anything. They had built him into a hollow, arrogant shell of a man, and that made him the absolute perfect mark for a cold-blooded predator like Chelsea. His entire existence, his confidence, his fake startup, his luxurious lifestyle was nothing but a fragile lie built by the enabling hands of his mother and father. He buried his face in his trembling hands and sobbed uncontrollably, realizing that his parents' toxic favoritism had not prepared him for the real world. It had only fattened him up for the slaughter. The illusion of the golden child was completely dead, and now he was left with absolutely nothing but the cold steel bars of a federal prison cell and the knowledge that his own arrogance had destroyed his entire family. The fallout from the gala was swift and absolutely merciless. While DeAndre sat in a federal holding cell waiting for a trial, he was guaranteed to lose. The swift gears of my corporate legal team turned exactly as I had designed them to. The foreclosure on the family home was executed with brutal efficiency. 3 weeks after the fake gala, Yvonne and Jerome were legally removed from the property they had arrogantly paraded around in for decades. Their cars were repossessed. Their remaining bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators looking for hidden assets, and their high society friends completely abandoned them overnight. I did not attend the eviction, but Elena sent me the confirmation when the locks were officially changed. I thought the silence from them meant they had finally understood the reality of their situation, but I underestimated their sheer entitlement. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the private concierge of my downtown luxury penthouse building called my secure line. He sounded deeply uncomfortable, explaining that my parents were causing a scene in the marble lobby, refusing to leave until they spoke to me. I stepped out of the private elevator a few minutes later, my heels clicking softly against the polished stone floor. The sight that greeted me was almost pathetic. Yvonne and Jerome were standing near the security desk, surrounded by a mountain of hastily packed designer luggage. Their clothes looked wrinkled, and their faces were drawn tight with exhaustion and panic. The arrogant posture they had carried their entire lives had completely collapsed, but the entitlement was still burning brightly in their eyes. When Jerome saw me approach, he immediately puffed out his chest, trying to summon the old patriarchal authority he used to wield over me like a weapon. Maya. Thank God, he said, his voice loud and demanding, echoing through the quiet lobby. Tell your security guard to help us with these bags. The bank locked us out of the house this morning, and we have been sitting in a diner all day trying to figure out logistics. We need you to clear out one of the guest rooms for us upstairs while we get this ridiculous misunderstanding sorted out with the federal prosecutors. I stopped a few feet away from them, crossing my arms over my chest, and just stared at him. I did not tell the guard to move. I did not offer them a warm greeting. I just looked at the massive pile of luggage, and then at the two people who had gladly sold my future to fund my brother's lies. Yvonne pushed past my father, her face twisting into a mask of desperate maternal manipulation. Maya, please, she whined, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but stopping when I took a deliberate step back. We have nowhere else to go. All our friends are suddenly out of town, and the church will not even take our calls. You are our daughter. We raised you and gave you life. You cannot just leave us out in the rain like this. We are family, and family sticks together when things get tough. I let a cold, humorless laugh escape my lips. Family. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. You did not care about family when you were helping DeAndre steal from the elderly. You did not care about family when you told everyone I was a jealous failure just to make your golden boy look better. You certainly did not care about family when you gladly mortgaged the house you raised me in to fund a criminal enterprise. You only care about family now because you have absolutely nothing left. Jerome slammed his hand down on the edge of the security desk, making the concierge jump. Do not speak to your mother that way. He barked, his face turning an angry shade of red. We are your parents, and you have a duty to us. You have money now, Maya. You have this massive company and this ridiculous building. It is the black tax. Successful children take care of the people who sacrificed for them. You owe us for everything we put into you, and you are going to take us upstairs right now. He was trying to weaponize cultural guilt, trying to use the concept of the black tax to force me into servitude after he had spent my entire life investing exclusively in his fraudulent son. He actually thought he could demand my resources as a right of birth while ignoring decades of emotional abuse and financial neglect. I looked at the angry, desperate man who shared my DNA, and I felt absolutely nothing. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a trifold glossy brochure. I held it out toward him, holding it between my index and middle finger. Jerome looked at it in confusion, slowly reaching out to take it. Yvonne leaned over his shoulder to read the cover, and all the remaining color drained directly out of her face. It was a brochure for a low-income subsidized housing complex on the far outskirts of the city. It was a place notorious for cramped apartments and long waiting lists, a place my parents used to mock whenever we drove past it. I looked directly into my father's eyes and delivered the exact words he had spoken to me years ago when I begged him for help to start my first company. "You need to be realistic, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, mimicking the exact condescending tone he had used on me. "You are adults. You made your choices, and now you need to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. Nobody owes you a handout." Yvonne let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she was having a heart attack. "You cannot do this to us," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "We will not survive in a place like that. We are your parents, Maya." "You were DeAndre's parents," I corrected her coldly. "You were just my landlords, and your lease expired a long time ago." I turned my back on them without another word. I did not look back as Jerome started shouting my name, demanding that I return. I did not look back as Yvonne collapsed against their mountain of luggage, weeping hysterically, in the lobby of a building she would never be allowed to enter. I walked straight to the private elevator, swiped my keycard, and stepped inside, the heavy steel doors sliding shut and cutting off the sound of their desperate screaming forever. I rode the elevator up to my penthouse, leaving the ghosts of my past exactly where they belonged. On the ground floor, begging for entry into a world they would never be part of again. The months leading up to the federal sentencing were a chaotic blur of desperate legal filings and rejected plea deals, but I remained completely focused on the final outcome. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator had closed on my parents that rainy Tuesday night, and I had not spoken a single word to them since. I knew they were living in the cramped, subsidized apartment I had given them the brochure for, but their fate was no longer my concern. My only focus was the cold, quiet morning when justice would finally be served. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was a massive, imposing structure of white marble and thick glass. When I arrived on the morning of the sentencing hearing, the wide concrete steps were absolutely swarming with local news crews and furious members of Pastor Thomas' congregation. I walked through the metal detectors wearing a sharply tailored black suit, my posture rigid and my expression completely unreadable. I took my seat in the front row of the courtroom, sitting directly behind the prosecutor's table. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of dozens of elderly victims who had lost their entire life savings to my brother's greed. The heavy side door of the courtroom creaked open, and the federal marshals led Chelsea into the room. She was wearing a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit that looked drastically oversized on her frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and she was deliberately slouching her shoulders to make herself look as small and fragile as possible. Her wealthy parents had flown in from Connecticut and were sitting in the row across the aisle from me. They looked at my brother with absolute, undisguised hatred. When the hearing began, Chelsea's expensive defense attorney immediately took the floor and launched into a sickeningly calculated narrative. He painted a pathetic picture of a helpless, innocent white woman who had been terrorized and held hostage by a violent, controlling thug. He used every racist dog whistle he could legally get away with to make DeAndre look like a dangerous monster. The lawyer claimed that Chelsea was entirely trapped in an abusive marriage and that she only facilitated the offshore wire transfers because she was terrified for her physical safety. Chelsea wept on cue, burying her face in her hands and shaking her shoulders to play the perfect traumatized victim. It was a disgusting performance, designed to erase her role as the actual mastermind of the entire criminal operation. I watched DeAndre sitting at the defense table while his own in-laws' family attorney publicly stripped him of his humanity and labeled him a brute. The arrogant golden child looked completely hollowed out. His face was sunken, and his eyes were wide with the terrifying realization that the woman he had married was fully prepared to step on his throat to save herself. When it was DeAndre's turn to speak, his court-appointed lawyer nudged him forward. DeAndre slowly stood up, dragging his heavy chains across the floor, and turned to face me across the crowded room. He swallowed hard and tried to deploy his old magnetic charm, but his voice just sounded weak and painfully desperate. "Maya, please," he croaked, clutching the wooden edge of the defense table. He begged for my forgiveness in front of the stern federal judge, claiming he was a broken man who had simply lost his way. He blamed our parents for putting too much pressure on him to succeed and claimed the weight of their expectations had driven him to make terrible mistakes. He wept genuine tears and promised that if the judge granted him a lenient sentence, he would spend the rest of his natural life working to repay the community and make his big sister proud. It was a manipulative, cowardly attempt to use family loyalty to buy his way out of federal prison. The judge stared down at him with a blank expression before calling me to the podium to deliver my victim impact statement. The entire courtroom fell dead silent as I walked up the center aisle. My high heels clicked sharply against the polished wood floor. I stood at the podium and looked directly at the judge. I did not shed a single tear. I did not speak about sadness or broken family bonds or the tragic downfall of a beloved brother. I spoke entirely about ruthless accountability. I detailed exactly how Chelsea and DeAndre had systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of our community. I explained how Chelsea had hired offshore hackers to attack my company's servers, proving she was not a terrified hostage, but a highly sophisticated cybercriminal who orchestrated the entire fraud. I then turned my attention to DeAndre. I told the court how he had sat in the living rooms of retired mechanics and elderly widows, drinking their sweet tea while knowingly stealing their pension funds. I stated clearly that neither of the defendants felt any genuine remorse for their actions. They were only sorry that their fake kingdom had collapsed. I asked the court to deliver a maximum sentence that reflected the absolute devastation they had intentionally caused to innocent people. When I finished speaking, the courtroom remained completely silent. I walked back to my seat and sat down, keeping my eyes locked on the front of the room. The federal judge adjusted his reading glasses and looked down from the high mahogany bench with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He addressed Chelsea first. The judge completely dismantled her fragile victim routine, reminding her that her encrypted chat logs proved she was the architect of the embezzlement. He told her that weaponizing her tears and using racist stereotypes to shift the blame only highlighted her sociopathic nature. He then turned his cold gaze to DeAndre. The judge labeled my brother a cowardly predator who had used the trust of his own community to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth. He explicitly stated that blaming his parents' expectations was the ultimate insult to the hardworking people he had robbed blind. The judge grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and raised it high in the air. He sentenced both Chelsea and DeAndre to exactly 8 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He also ordered full financial restitution to be paid to every single victim they had defrauded. The gavel slammed down with a deafening crack. The courtroom instantly erupted into cheers and tears of relief from the defrauded investors. The sound of pure justice echoed off the marble walls. Chelsea began to shriek hysterically, her pristine, innocent facade completely shattering into a million pieces. She fought against the federal marshals, wildly kicking her legs as they grabbed her arms to drag her away. DeAndre did not fight at all. He just stood there completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the floor as the heavy iron chains were locked securely around his wrists and ankles. I sat perfectly still and watched with absolute cold clarity. I watched the perfect wife and the golden child being dragged out of the courtroom in heavy iron shackles, their fraudulent kingdom completely and permanently destroyed, leaving me free to finally live my life in peace. Stepping out of the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse, the afternoon sun felt entirely different against my skin. The thick, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 27 long years was completely and permanently gone. The media circus outside the building was chaotic, with reporters shouting questions and camera flashes blinding the crowd. But my private security team formed a tight, impenetrable circle around me, guiding me smoothly toward my waiting car. I slid into the quiet leather-back seat and instructed my driver to take me back to my corporate office. Elena handed me a tablet with our latest quarterly projections, and for the first time in months, my mind was completely clear. There were no more fires to put out, no more toxic family members to block, and no more fraudulent schemes to unravel. The relentless gears of the criminal justice system had swallowed my brother and his elegant wife whole. They were now federal inmates destined to spend the next 8 years locked in concrete cells, while I remained in the quiet, luxurious hum of my own success. Life quickly returned to a peaceful and highly productive rhythm. Weeks passed without a single disruption. My company expanded its reach into 2 new international markets, and local business journals featured my face on their front covers, not as a tragic victim of a family scandal, but as a resilient, brilliant CEO who had outsmarted a massive financial conspiracy. The contrast between my reality and the reality of the people who shared my blood was absolute. It was a quiet, rainy Friday evening when the final ghost of my past reached out to me. I was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the twilight fade over the glittering Atlanta skyline while sipping a glass of expensive red wine. The soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers was suddenly interrupted when my personal private cell phone began to vibrate on the cool marble kitchen island. I walked over and glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar local number. Normally, I would let an unknown call go directly to voicemail, but a strange intuition told me to answer it. I tapped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the sound of heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. Then a voice spoke, soft and trembling, entirely stripped of the haughty, demanding arrogance I had known my entire life. "Maya, please do not hang up," the voice pleaded. It was my mother. The tone was so fragile, so utterly broken, that I almost did not recognize it as Yvonne's. I stood perfectly still, the cold crystal of my wine goblet pressed tightly against my palm. I did not offer a polite greeting or demand to know how she got my secure number. I just waited, listening to the sound of her quiet, desperate sobbing through the phone speaker. The tears she was crying were not her usual manipulative performance. There was no theatrical anger and no demanding guilt trips. They were the raw, heavy tears of an older woman who had finally been crushed by the absolute reality of her own terrible choices. "Maya, I am so sorry," my mother wept, her voice cracking with every agonizing syllable. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything. We have lost it all, Maya. The beautiful house, the luxury cars, our wealthy friends, our pristine reputation. But the absolute worst thing I lost was you." She paused, taking a shaky, rattling breath as she tried to compose herself. "Jerome and I are living in this tiny, dark apartment in the subsidized complex you showed us. The walls are paper thin and the heat barely works. We sit here every single day staring at the cheap linoleum floor and realizing exactly what we have done to ourselves. We gave everything we had, every dollar and every ounce of our love, to a son who only saw us as a disposable bank account. We happily mortgaged our entire future to fund his lies, and we blindly worshipped a daughter-in-law who looked at us with absolute pure disgust. Chelsea hated us, Maya. She mocked us to the federal agents, and DeAndre did not even try to defend us in that courtroom. He just threw us under the bus and begged the judge to save himself. We prioritized a golden boy who threw us directly to the wolves the exact second his fake kingdom collapsed. She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob that echoed loudly through the quiet, peaceful space of my penthouse. "We completely failed you?" she cried, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate wail. "You were the one who worked hard. You were the one who built a real life with real integrity. You tried to warn us about his company, and we treated you like a jealous enemy. We were so blinded by foolish pride and outdated tradition that we threw away the only child who actually loved us. Please, Maya, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Let me see you. Let me try to be a real mother to you. We can start over. I will do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness. Just please do not leave us in the dark." I stood there looking out at the endless, glittering lights of the city far below me. I felt the profound, heavy weight of her words sinking deep into my bones. For 27 years, this was exactly the apology I had wanted to hear. I had spent my entire childhood starving for this exact validation, craving the moment my mother would finally see my worth and acknowledge her cruelty. I had cried myself to sleep so many times wishing she would just choose me. But hearing those desperate pleading words now, I realized something deeply profound. The scared little girl inside me who needed that apology was completely gone. I had mourned her and buried her a long time ago. I did not feel any lingering anger toward the weeping broken woman on the phone, but I also did not feel any love or obligation. The well of my empathy had simply run completely dry. Opening the door, even a crack, would only let the poison back into the beautiful, peaceful fortress I had built for myself. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch between us one final time. "I forgive you, Mom," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, carrying absolutely no malice and no warmth. "But forgiveness does not mean access." Yvonne let out a sharp, devastated gasp, but I did not stay on the line to listen to her response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button ending the call forever. I navigated to my phone settings, clicked on the unfamiliar number, and hit block permanently. I set the phone face down on the cool marble counter, picked up my wine glass, and walked back toward the massive windows, completely and finally free. The morning air was crisp and cool as my driver pulled the black sedan up to the familiar wrought iron gates of the estate. This was the very same driveway where I had once stood as a teenager watching my parents buy DeAndre his first luxury car while telling me I needed to get a part-time job to pay for my own college textbooks. The massive colonial house loomed at the end of the paved path, looking exactly as it had for the last 20 years. But the fundamental reality of this property had completely shifted. The bank had foreclosed on it to cover the massive debts my parents had incurred trying to fund my brother's fraudulent lifestyle. As soon as it hit the market, my corporate acquisition team had swooped in and purchased it in cash. I now owned the very ground my parents had used to make me feel small. Elena was already waiting for me on the front porch, holding a sleek leather folio. She handed me the heavy brass keys without saying a single word, completely understanding the profound weight of this moment. I turned the key in the lock and pushed open the massive oak doors, stepping into the cavernous foyer. The house was completely empty. The moving company had come days ago to pack up whatever cheap remaining furniture the federal investigators had not seized. Our footsteps echoed loudly against the imported hardwood floors as we walked through the vacant rooms. I walked slowly into the formal dining room where countless family dinners had taken place. I stood in the exact spot where Jerome used to sit at the head of the table, commanding absolute authority, while Yvonne served DeAndre the largest portions of food. This was the room where they had mocked my business plans, where they had called my ambitions foolish, where they had told me I would never succeed without a man to guide me. Now there was nothing here but bare walls and the quiet hum of the central air conditioning. I felt no anger standing there, and I felt no sadness. The space simply felt dead, stripped of all the toxic power it once held over my life. I climbed the grand sweeping staircase and walked down the long hallway toward our childhood bedrooms. I stopped in front of DeAndre's old room. It was the master guest suite, complete with its own private bathroom and a walk-in closet. My parents had given him the best room in the house the moment he turned 10, treating him like a prince who deserved absolute luxury. Then I walked to the end of the narrow corridor and opened the door to my old room. It was tiny, barely big enough for a twin bed and a desk. This was the room where I had stayed up late into the night, studying, teaching myself how to code, building the foundation of a tech empire, while my family slept soundly, completely ignoring my existence. Looking at the small empty space, I realized that their neglect had actually been a strange kind of gift. Because they never handed me anything, I was forced to learn how to build everything from scratch. Elena cleared her throat softly, pulling me from my memories. She stepped into the small room and opened the leather folio, presenting me with a stack of legal documents and a heavy silver pen. "The deed to the property is ready for your signature, Maya," she said quietly. I took the pen and looked at the transfer of ownership papers. I had absolutely no intention of keeping this house. I did not want to live in a place saturated with the ghosts of my parents, toxic favoritism, and I did not want to sell it just to add more money to my accounts. Instead, I had instructed my legal team to transfer the property entirely to the Phoenix Foundation. It was a local nonprofit organization dedicated to providing safe transitional housing and career mentorship for young, ambitious Black women who had been estranged from toxic or abusive families. I signed my name with a smooth, steady hand, legally turning the sprawling colonial estate into a sanctuary for girls who felt just as isolated and undervalued as I once did. We were going to knock down the walls, redesign the interior, and fill this property with young women who were hungry for success, giving them the support and resources their own families had denied them. I handed the pen back to Elena, feeling a profound sense of closure settle deep into my chest. The past was officially overwritten. By noon, the local news vans had parked along the edge of the manicured lawn. My public relations team had coordinated a press conference to announce the massive donation. I stood on the front steps of the estate wearing a sharp, tailored ivory suit, the bright sunlight catching the subtle gold jewelry at my wrists. The reporters thrust their microphones forward, eager to hear the story of the brilliant tech CEO who had purchased her family estate only to give it away. A reporter from the leading city broadcast asked me why I chose to donate such a valuable piece of prime real estate. I looked directly into the camera lens, my expression calm and completely assured. "I believe that success is not just about accumulating wealth," I told the reporter, my voice carrying clearly over the quiet hum of the cameras. "It is about dismantling the structures that hold people back and creating spaces where ambition is nurtured instead of punished. There are so many brilliant young women out there who are told they are not enough, who are pushed aside by their own families. This house will now be a place where those women are given a seat at the table. If your family refuses to build you a table, you have to build your own." Miles away on the miserable outskirts of the city, a small, flickering television set illuminated the dark, cramped living room of a subsidized, low-income apartment. Yvonne and Jerome sat on a cheap, stained sofa they had found at a thrift store, their faces bathed in the harsh blue light of the local news broadcast. The paper-thin walls of their building vibrated with the sounds of their neighbors fighting, but the room itself was deathly silent. They stared at the screen, watching their daughter stand on the porch of the magnificent home they had lost. They listened to my words about toxic families and building new tables. Yvonne pulled a frayed blanket tightly around her shoulders, tears leaking silently down her wrinkled cheeks as she watched the daughter she had called a disappointment being praised as a local legend. Jerome just stared blankly at the screen, his hands trembling in his lap, absolutely broken by the magnitude of his failure. They sat together in the cold, suffocating darkness of their tiny rented box, completely ruined by the devastating realization that the child they had casually thrown away had grown into a queen, and they would never ever be allowed inside her kingdom. The weeks following the foreclosure and the final sentencing brought a strange quiet to my personal life, but a massive storm was brewing inside my company. Chelsea's clumsy but destructive offshore hack had triggered automatic federal oversight protocols. Because my cybersecurity firm handled sensitive defense contracts, the government was required to launch a comprehensive federal audit. It was not just a routine inspection, it was a brutal, microscopic examination of every single line of code, every financial ledger, and every security protocol my team had ever built. The Department of Defense sent a team of elite forensic auditors who essentially moved into our headquarters, setting up a command center in our secondary conference room. The pressure was absolutely suffocating. Rumors were swirling in the tech industry that my firm might lose its security clearance entirely because a breach had occurred so close to the CEO. Competitors were circling like sharks, hoping the federal government would strip us of our contracts. My board of directors was nervous, and even my most confident investors were holding their breath, waiting to see if the empire I had built was about to collapse under the weight of my family's criminal mess. But I did not panic, and I did not hide. Instead of acting like a defensive executive, I treated the federal auditors like partners. I instructed Elena and my lead engineers to give the Defense Department absolute unrestricted access to everything. We handed over the exact digital traps I had built to catch Chelsea, the unedited server logs, and the precise timeline of how I had gathered the evidence and marched it straight to the FBI. I hid absolutely nothing. I wanted them to see every single scar on the system, because those scars proved that the fortress could not be compromised even by an inside threat. For 3 exhausting weeks, the auditors tore my company apart. They worked through the weekends interviewing my staff, testing our firewalls, and analyzing the financial ledgers that Chelsea had tried to manipulate. I barely slept, taking quick naps on the leather sofa in my office and living on cold coffee and sheer adrenaline. I knew that everything I had sacrificed for everything I had chosen over my toxic family was riding on the outcome of this investigation. On a crisp Thursday morning, the lead auditor, a stern older man with sharp gray eyes, requested a formal meeting in my main boardroom. I walked in with Elena by my side, my posture perfectly straight despite the crushing exhaustion in my bones. The auditor sat at the head of the long mahogany table with his thick report perfectly aligned in front of him. He looked at me for a long time without speaking, letting the heavy silence fill the room. He finally opened the folder and stated that the audit was officially concluded. He told me that in his 30 years of investigating corporate breaches, he had never seen a CEO handle a security threat with such ruthless precision and absolute transparency. He pointed out that instead of trying to cover up the family connection to protect my public image, I had personally engineered the capture of the criminals and delivered a flawless, airtight case to federal prosecutors. My willingness to sacrifice my own flesh and blood to protect the integrity of my clients' data had deeply impressed the highest levels of the Defense Department. He closed the folder and looked me dead in the eye. He told me that the government was not going to revoke our security clearance. Instead, because I had proven that my firm possessed an incorruptible level of operational integrity, the Department of Defense was expanding our current partnership. He formally announced that they were awarding my company a brand new exclusive contract to overhaul the security infrastructure for their regional command centers. The contract was worth $50 million. The shock in the room was palpable, but I simply nodded, thanking him for his thorough work and his trust in my team. Elena squeezed my arm tightly, her professional composure slipping just enough to show a massive proud smile. We walked the auditors to the private elevator, shaking their hands and watching the heavy doors slide shut. When they were gone, I walked slowly back into the empty boardroom. The morning sun was pouring through the massive glass windows, warming the polished wood of the long table. A few moments later, the heavy double doors opened and my core team filed into the room. Elena came first, followed by my lead security architect, my chief financial officer, and the brilliant young developers who had stayed awake for countless nights helping me build the trap that caught Chelsea. They were exhausted, their eyes lined with dark circles, but they were absolutely beaming. Someone popped the cork on a bottle of expensive champagne, and the sound echoed like a gunshot of pure victory. Glasses were passed around, and the room filled with the warm, beautiful sound of genuine laughter and shared relief. I stood at the head of the table holding my glass and looking at the incredible people standing in front of me. I looked at the team who had never questioned my leadership, who had stood by me when the media was circling, who had trusted my vision even when it meant risking their own careers. They did not share my DNA, and we did not share a childhood, but looking at their tired, happy faces, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of belonging that I had never once felt in my parents' colonial house. For my entire life, I had been chasing the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. I had begged for a seat at a table where I was always meant to starve. But as I raised my glass to toast the brilliant, loyal people who had helped me protect my empire, I finally understood the truth. Blood did not make a family. Respect, loyalty, and unconditional support made a family. I had not lost a family at all. I had just finally found the courage to build my own. 6 months after the federal audit, my life looked completely different than anything my parents had ever planned for me. I had relocated my primary residence out of the city and bought a massive custom-built beachfront property down on the coast. It was a place made entirely of glass and white oak, designed perfectly to let in the natural light and the sound of the ocean. I was sitting out on my sprawling teak balcony on a Tuesday morning, watching the tide roll in and feeling the warm, salty breeze against my face. There was a time in my life when my mornings were consumed by the anxiety of trying to please a family that was fundamentally designed to break me down. But now, the only sound I woke up to was the rhythmic crashing of the waves. Elena had driven down for the week to help me finalize the operational logistics for the new Defense Department contract. She walked out onto the balcony holding a silver tray with fresh coffee and the morning mail that the private courier had just dropped off. She set the tray down on the glass patio table and gave me a quiet, knowing look before pointing to a single envelope sitting on top of the stack. I picked up my coffee mug and let my eyes drop to the mail. It was a cheap, thin, beige envelope stamped with the unmistakable bleak black ink of a federal correctional institution. The return address was a penitentiary in Florida, and the handwriting was sloppy and desperate. It was from DeAndre. I did not even have to tear the seal to know exactly what was written on the cheap lined paper inside. I knew the exact words he had chosen. I knew he had filled the pages with pathetic excuses and desperate apologies, trying to tap into the well of sisterly guilt that he had relied on for his entire life. I knew he was begging for money to be put into his prison commissary account, claiming that the food was terrible and that he was suffering. I knew he probably ended the letter by telling me that he loved his sister and that family is supposed to stick together when times get tough. He had spent 27 years stealing my peace and my resources, and even from inside a federal cage, he was still trying to reach out and take whatever he could grasp. I picked up the envelope, holding it delicately between my index and middle finger. I felt absolutely nothing for the man who had written it. The profound, heavy sadness that used to choke me whenever I thought about my brother had been entirely replaced by a cool, permanent indifference. He was just a stranger now, a cautionary tale about greed and entitlement. I turned away from the ocean and walked back inside the house, stepping through the sliding glass doors into my pristine home office. There was a heavy-duty paper shredder sitting discreetly next to my mahogany desk. I turned it on, listening to the sharp, aggressive hum of the metal blades coming to life. I did not open the letter. I did not read a single word of his pathetic apologies. I simply held the envelope over the slot and let go. The machine grabbed the paper, pulling it down instantly, and grinding my brother's desperate pleas into thousands of tiny, unreadable ribbons. The sound was incredibly satisfying. It was the final period at the end of a very long and very toxic sentence. I turned the machine off and walked back out onto the balcony, leaning against the glass railing and letting the morning sun warm my skin. I reached into the pocket of my silk lounge pants and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and tapped on my secure banking app, waiting for the facial recognition to let me in. I thought back to years ago when I used to check my balance with a tight knot of panic in my stomach, hiding every dollar I made so my father could not demand it to pay off DeAndre's debts. I used to look at my accounts and wonder if I would ever have enough to finally buy my freedom. The screen loaded and the bold black numbers appeared against the bright white background. The balance reflected the initial massive payout from the new federal contract, along with the steady, aggressive growth of my private investments. The number staring back at me was firmly in the eight figures. Tens of millions of dollars, entirely legally earned and completely mine. It was more money than Jerome and Yvonne had ever seen in their entire lives. It was an absolute, unbreakable fortress of security that no one would ever be able to penetrate. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, taking a slow, deep breath of the clean ocean air. I looked directly out at the endless blue horizon and felt an overwhelming sense of power. They called me selfish for protecting what was mine. My parents, my brother, their friends. Everyone who thought they had a right to my energy and my success told me I was a cold and bitter daughter. But I learned the hard way that in a family that only loves you for what they can take from you, being selfish is the exact only way to survive. You cannot build an empire if you are constantly letting toxic people tear down the foundation. You have to be willing to walk away from the table they built for you and construct your own. Have you ever had to cut off the people who share your blood to protect your peace? Tell me your story. Sometimes the hardest battles we face are against the people who share our blood. Maya's journey teaches us that loyalty should never be a trap, and that walking away from a toxic foundation is the first step toward building an unbreakable empire. True family is not determined by genetics, but by the people who stand with you in the trenches and protect your peace by choosing herself. She did not just survive, she conquered. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to build your own table? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of resilience.